I spent years watching Washington declare victory while refusing to measure reality. The problem was never that the United States lacked power, it was that we substituted narrative for truth and called it strategy. From the end of the Cold War onward, we convinced ourselves that winning battles, toppling regimes, or holding elections equaled success. Intelligence was supposed to test those assumptions. Instead, it was bent to protect them. I saw this most clearly in the post 9/11 era when urgency and fear created a permissive environment for analytic shortcuts. Assessments were framed to support decisions already made. Caveats were buried. Dissent was treated as disloyalty. The result was a series of wins that looked good in briefings but collapsed under scrutiny. Take Iraq. The invasion achieved its initial military objective quickly. Baghdad fell. The regime collapsed. That was labeled a win. But the intelligence failure was not just about weapons of mass destruction. It was about a deeper refusal to assess Iraqi society, regional dynamics, and second-order effects. Honestly, analysts who warned about sectarian fracture, insurgency, and Iranian influence were marginalized. We measured success by milestones, statues toppled, elections held while ignoring indicators that mattered: legitimacy, security, and governance. The strategic consequence was predictable. We won tactically and lost strategically, hemorrhaging credibility with allies and adversaries who could see the gap between our claims and conditions on the ground. This pattern repeated in Afghanistan. Each year brought new metrics designed to demonstrate progress. Districts cleared, Afghan forces trained, Taliban degraded. Intelligence reporting became a factory for optimism. When reality intruded, the answer was to adjust the narrative, not the policy. The analytical breakdown was institutional. Collection focused on what could be counted, not what mattered. Reporting chains rewarded compliance. Senior leaders demanded certainty where none existed. The hard lesson is simple: power without truth is fragile. You can surge troops, money, and technology, but if intelligence is corrupted by the need to show success, you are flying blind. That blindness did more damage to American credibility than any enemy action. We didn't lose because we were weak. We lost because we lied to ourselves. I watched intelligence cross a line it was never supposed to cross. Analysis stopped being a tool to inform policy and became a weapon to defend it. This did not happen overnight, and it did not begin with Iraq, but Iraq is where the damage became undeniable. Before the invasion, intelligence products were shaped less by evidence than by expectation. Senior policymakers did not ask, "What do we know?" They asked, "How strong is the case?" That distinction matters. When analysis is framed to support a predetermined outcome, uncertainty becomes an inconvenience, and inconvenient facts are treated as obstacles to be managed. Inside the system, the shift was subtle but corrosive. Language changed. Judgments hardened beyond what sources justified. Dissenting footnotes were stripped out or relegated to obscurity. Analysts learned quickly which conclusions were welcome and which ones stalled careers. The process rewarded confidence over accuracy. This was not classic fabrication. It was something more insidious: selective amplification. Weak sourcing was elevated if it aligned with policy aims. Strong countervailing evidence was discounted as unreliable or hostile. Over time, this created a feedback loop in which policymakers cited intelligence that had already been shaped to echo their preferences, then used that citation to demand even firmer analytic support. The strategic consequence was catastrophic. When intelligence becomes advocacy, it loses its corrective function. Decision makers stop hearing bad news until it arrives on the battlefield or in headlines. In Iraq, the collapse of post-war planning was blamed on execution, not on analytic failure. In Afghanistan, the persistence of the Taliban was framed as resilience rather than proof that foundational assumptions were wrong. Counterterrorism assessments routinely overstated disruption while underestimating regeneration. Each time, the solution was more resources, more authorities, and more optimistic reporting. The institution protected itself by doubling down. The analytical breakdown was systemic. Collection priorities were skewed toward confirming policy success. Human intelligence was neglected in favor of technical reporting that produced volume without context. Metrics replaced judgment. Intelligence officers became briefers of talking points rather than assessors of reality. The hard lesson is one the profession used to understand instinctively. Intelligence that serves power instead of truth ultimately serves neither. Once credibility is lost internally, external credibility soon follows. Allies begin to hedge. Adversaries discount warnings. The public stops believing official explanations. By the time leaders realize they have been misled, they are often the authors of the deception. That is how intelligence becomes fiction, plausible, polished, and strategically useless. The most damaging conflict I witnessed was not overseas, it was internal. It was the quiet war against dissenting intelligence. Once analysis became advocacy, dissent became a threat. Analysts who challenged prevailing narratives were no longer seen as professionals doing their job. They were labeled obstacles, contrarians, or worse, politically unreliable. This cultural shift did more to hollow out American intelligence than any budget cut or external adversary. When honest disagreement is punished, the system trains itself to fail. I saw how this worked in practice. Products that questioned optimistic assumptions were delayed, rewritten, or killed in coordination. Career advancement became tied to being aligned, a euphemism everyone understood. Managers learned to protect their units by anticipating what senior leadership wanted to hear. That pressure cascaded downward. Younger analysts absorbed the lesson quickly. Skepticism carried risk, certainty brought reward. Over time, this produced a self-selecting body of reporting that looked rigorous on the surface, but was strategically brittle. The consequences were visible across multiple theaters. In Iraq, analysts who warned that dissolving the Iraqi army would fuel insurgency were sidelined. In Afghanistan, those who reported that the Kabul government lacked legitimacy outside urban centers were ignored. In Syria, dissenting views on arming opposition groups were treated as defeatism until weapons predictably migrated to extremist factions. Each case followed the same pattern. Early warnings existed. They were suppressed or diluted. When outcomes proved disastrous, accountability evaporated. The failure was reframed as unforeseeable rather than unheeded. The strategic consequence was the institutionalization of groupthink. Intelligence lost its diversity of judgment, which is its core strength. Policymakers received a narrow band of views reinforced by repetition. Alternatives disappeared not because they were disproven, but because they were never allowed to mature. This made American strategy predictable to adversaries who understood that our assessments were driven by political constraints. They learned to wait us out, to exploit our timelines, and to discount our red lines. Credibility eroded not because enemies doubted our capabilities, but because they doubted our self-awareness. The analytical breakdown was cultural, not technical. The system retained enormous collection capacity, but it lost intellectual honesty. Analysts became narrators of inevitability rather than examiners of risk. The hard lesson is unforgiving. An intelligence community that cannot tolerate dissent will eventually be surprised by reality. You can silence internal critics for a time, but you cannot silence consequences. When dissent dies, warning dies with it, and when warning dies, strategy follows. One of the most effective ways we deceived ourselves was by turning measurement into camouflage. When strategy faltered, we reached for metrics. Numbers have authority, charts look decisive. They create the illusion of control. I watched this happen repeatedly as complex political and social conflicts were reduced to quantifiable indicators that said more about bureaucratic needs than battlefield reality. We counted what was easy to count and ignored what was hard to measure, then acted surprised when outcomes diverged from forecasts. In Iraq and Afghanistan, body counts, districts controlled, and forces trained became substitutes for understanding legitimacy, cohesion, and will. Intelligence reporting fed this addiction. Collection focused on producing data points that could be briefed upward. Commanders needed numbers to demonstrate progress. Policymakers needed them to justify continuation. Intelligence obliged. Each metric had an internal logic, but together they formed a picture that was fundamentally misleading. A district could be cleared during the day and revert at night. A unit could be trained on paper and dissolve under pressure. Elections could be held without conferring authority. The metrics moved in the right direction while the war moved in the wrong one. The distortion extended beyond counterinsurgency. In counterterrorism, success was measured by leaders killed and plots disrupted, while network regeneration and ideological diffusion were discounted. In sanctions policy, economic pain was tallied while political resilience was ignored. Intelligence assessments emphasized short-term effects because they were measurable. Even as long-term adaptations went underreported, adversaries learned quickly. They absorbed losses, adjusted tactics, and exploited our fixation on indicators that made us feel effective but left us strategically exposed. The strategic consequence was a widening gap between reporting and reality. Decision makers were lulled into believing that time was on our side. When setbacks occurred, they were framed as anomalies rather than symptoms. This delayed course correction and increased costs. By the time metrics finally turned negative, options had narrowed. Withdrawal became collapse. Negotiation became concession. Credibility suffered because partners and adversaries alike could see that our internal story did not match external conditions. The analytical breakdown was methodological. Intelligence failed to integrate qualitative judgment with quantitative data. Analysts knew the limits of the metrics, but those limits were rarely emphasized. Caveats were treated as fine print. The hard lesson is enduring. Metrics are tools, not truths. When numbers are used to protect policy instead of inform it, they become lies by omission. Strategy built on misleading measures will fail predictably and publicly. Sanctions became the policy tool of choice when military options were costly and diplomacy required concessions no one wanted to admit. They were sold as precision instruments, coercive without bloodshed, decisive without escalation. Intelligence was tasked with proving they worked. Over time, assessments drifted from measuring impact to defending premise. We counted economic pain and inferred political submission. When submission did not follow, the answer was more sanctions, not better analysis. I watched this play out against Russia, Iran, and others. Reporting emphasized currency depreciation, inflation spikes, and trade disruptions. Those effects were real, but they were not decisive. What intelligence consistently underplayed was adaptation, substitution, smuggling networks, alternative payment systems, and domestic political consolidation. Sanctions often strengthened hardliners by validating siege narratives and discrediting moderates who had argued for engagement. Intelligence flagged these dynamics early, but they were rarely elevated because they complicated the story policymakers wanted to tell. Signals compounded the problem. Public red lines were drawn without private credibility. Warnings were issued that assumed rational responses aligned with our preferences. When adversaries tested those lines and faced limited consequences, deterrence eroded. Intelligence assessments that questioned signaling efficacy were softened to avoid appearing defeatist. The result was a cycle of declaratory policy untethered from capability or will. Adversaries learned to read the gap. Allies learned to hedge. Both adjusted their behavior accordingly. The strategic consequence was accelerated bloc formation and financial diversification. As sanctions proliferated, so did efforts to bypass them. Intelligence reported on these trends, but often as peripheral developments rather than strategic shifts. De-dollarization was treated as aspirational rhetoric until it became operational reality in energy trade, reserves management, and bilateral settlements. By the time Washington acknowledged the risk, leverage had already diminished. Sanctions remained, but their marginal effect declined while their political cost rose. The analytical breakdown was conceptual. Intelligence assessed sanctions as isolated levers rather than components of long-term strategic competition. We measured compliance events instead of structural change. We mistook friction for control. The hard lesson is uncomfortable. Coercion without credibility invites resistance, and pressure without pathways hardens opposition. Intelligence must evaluate not just whether a tool hurts, but whether it moves the adversary toward an outcome we can actually secure. When analysis is constrained to validate policy, self-deception becomes strategy, and strategy becomes erosion. The most corrosive effect of years of narrative-driven foreign policy was that it did not stay overseas. Techniques developed to sell wars, sanctions, and interventions abroad migrated inward. Intelligence language, once reserved for assessing adversaries, was repurposed to frame domestic politics. Threat inflation, selective disclosure, and insinuation replaced evidence-based judgment. I watched as the boundary between national security analysis and political messaging blurred, then collapsed. This shift was not accidental. Once intelligence institutions accept narrative management as normal, the target set inevitably expands. Leaks became tools, anonymous assessments were floated to shape opinion rather than inform decision-making. The press learned which phrases signaled authority and repeated them without scrutiny. Public trust eroded as claims were walked back or quietly abandoned. Each correction reinforced the perception that intelligence was no longer a neutral arbiter of fact, but a participant in political conflict. The strategic consequence was profound. When intelligence is perceived as partisan, it loses legitimacy with large segments of the population. That skepticism does not remain neatly contained. It spills over into foreign policy credibility. Adversaries exploit it by amplifying contradictions and highlighting reversals. Allies question whether commitments will survive electoral cycles. Deterrence relies not just on capability, but on belief in coherent decision-making. Narrative warfare at home undercuts that belief. From an analytic standpoint, the damage was cumulative. Internal confidence suffered as officers questioned whether their work would be used as intended. Recruitment and retention were affected as the profession's apolitical ethos eroded. Intelligence became reactive, focused on managing perception rather than anticipating risk. Warning intelligence is hardest to deliver when the audience doubts the messenger. The system learned to prioritize defensibility over accuracy, which is fatal in crises where speed and trust matter most. The hard lesson is stark. Intelligence cannot serve two masters. If it becomes an instrument of domestic persuasion, it forfeits its authority as an instrument of national security. Restoring credibility is not about better messaging or tighter controls on leaks. It requires a reassertion of purpose and discipline that has been missing for years. Without that reset, every assessment will be filtered through suspicion, and every warning will be discounted as agenda. That is a strategic vulnerability no adversary needs to create for us. We built it ourselves. By the time the consequences of these failures became impossible to ignore, many in Washington reached for familiar solutions. New doctrines, new technologies, new force posture. That reflex misses the point. The collapse of the American strategic narrative was not caused by insufficient power. It was caused by institutional decay. Intelligence failed not because it lacked access or resources, but because its relationship with politics became inverted. Instead of informing political choice, it was shaped by it. That inversion cannot be fixed on the battlefield. The next battle is political because the root problem is governance. Intelligence oversight became performative, focused on process rather than substance. Congressional scrutiny often reinforced partisan narratives instead of interrogating assumptions. Executive leadership blurred the line between analysis and advocacy, then acted surprised when trust evaporated. None of this is abstract. It determines whether future warnings are believed, whether deterrence signals are credible, and whether allies align or drift. From an intelligence perspective, the repair is conceptually simple and institutionally difficult. Analysis must be insulated from policy preference, not by slogans but by incentives. Career advancement should reward accuracy and intellectual courage, not alignment. Dissent must be normalized and protected. Estimates must foreground uncertainty rather than bury it. These are not reforms that require new authorities. They require political will to accept uncomfortable truths. Strategically, the United States faces competitors who study our failures carefully. They understand that credibility is cumulative and fragile. They exploit inconsistency and narrative overreach. Restoring strategic position will not come from louder declarations or harsher tools. It will come from reestablishing a reputation for sober assessment and disciplined decision making. Intelligence is central to that effort, but only if it is allowed to function as designed. The final hard lesson is this: winning was never enough if it was built on illusion. Tactical success without analytic honesty produced strategic defeat. If intelligence remains a vehicle for fiction, the erosion will continue regardless of who holds office or what policies are announced. The battle now is over whether truth can reassert itself inside institutions that have grown accustomed to managing perception. That is a political fight, not a military one. And until it is resolved, every future victory will carry the seeds of the next failure.